After 20 years on the road, you get used to the little things that warn you. An old light bulb when it flickers a certain way. The smell of diesel that says a rig's been worked too hard. The way a rest stop will feel alive or dead from 100 yards. You think you've seen it all. Then there are nights that don't make sense. Nights that leave you staring at the dash, hands white on the wheel, wondering if the highway just tried to teach you something, and you couldn't quite catch the lesson. I'm not an easy mark. I don't tell stories to get a reaction. I've got years of roots, miles that go in a straight line until the map runs out, and the kind of hands that know more about getting home than most people my age. Still, there are 5 times on the road that I carry like stones in my pocket. They sit there all the time. People hear them and laugh. Sure, buddy, ghosts on Route 40. Fair. Laugh if you want. But I'm telling them anyway because someone should know about these kinds of things, even if the only thing they prove is that the road keeps its secrets. If you like midnight road horror, hit subscribe and stick around. Maybe you've been through something like this, maybe you haven't. Either way, keep the lights low. The first one happened on a night when the gauge lied to me. I was on a long run between 2 cities, no names matter, just a long stretch where the only lights are the ones on the highway and whatever your rig's headlights catch. My gauge dipped earlier than usual. Not bad, but enough to make me start looking for a lighted circle on the map. A rusty sign said, "Gas 2 miles," the kind of placard that looks like it's been nailed up by someone who gave up pinning a number to the world. Sometimes those signs are wrong, most times they're honest. That night, it led me to a place that shouldn't have been there. The station sat off the shoulder like a thing that had been forgotten, neon long dead, one pump standing like a lonely tooth. The windows were dark, but the door had a note pinned to it, paper with the words "Back soon," hand-scrawled and curling at the edges. I didn't like that note. Notes like that belong on farmhouses, not on places that sell fuel to semi-trucks. Everything at the place smelled wrong, not the diesel smell, something colder. When I walked from my cab to the storefront, the air felt like it had been held tight, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. No hum of a fridge, no slow step of a clerk, no distant music bumping from inside. Just more silence than a place like that should keep. I thought about turning on my radio, but the quiet was its own radio, one that played metal and static and the sound of my own breath. When I looked in the glass of the storefront, my reflection stared back at me, doubled by the weak light of my cab. For a second I thought I saw something move behind me in that reflection. Not behind me in the lot, but inside the dark of the store. A silhouette that didn't have any features. Just a shape standing where a counter should be, right behind where a cashier would normally stand. I walked to the door and tapped it. "Hello?" I called, trying for friendly and getting something that probably sounded raw. The door was locked. The note said, "Back soon." I left a card on the handle, my name, my number, just in case. Truckers do that. We leave numbers like breadcrumbs. When I leaned into my mirror to look at the front of my trailer, there were marks on the glass, faint, like someone had dragged a set of fingers across the dust. I remember they looked too small to be the hand of the kind of person who would be a regular at a station like that. Tiny, thin prints in the lower corner of the mirror, as if some child had traced a path with long fingers. I wiped them with my sleeve and thought maybe a janitor had been in. Maybe some kid living nearby had been playing. Nobody's kid is supposed to wander into a closed truck stop at midnight, but the road attracts the desperate. Then came the sound. From inside the dark of the building, a dragging noise, like someone sliding a bucket or a mop across a tiled floor. Not quick, not violent. A slow, steady sound that told me there was something moving where there shouldn't have been anyone. My chest tightened. I'm not proud of the way I jumped at that sound. Pride doesn't buy you more miles. I backed my rig up to the pump because the gauge had me worried, and when I turned off the engine, the sudden silence went from heavy to oppressive. The cab's heater cooled. The only thing moving was my own breath in my visor and the small white of my knuckles on the wheel. I reached for the pump, and the handle was warm, like someone had just been using it. I swear to God it was warm. I told myself the sun might have been low earlier. Residual heat. Nonsense. Logic tries to be a comfort sometimes. Other times, it is only a way to keep you talking. Right when I clicked the nozzle away, something at the front of the store shifted in the reflection of the glass. Not a movement like stepping, but a presence, like the air had a shape. I turned and there it was. A silhouette standing in the doorway of what I guess had been an office. No features, just darker than the dark behind it. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It was as if someone had cut a hole in the night and that shape slipped into it. My truck wouldn't turn over for a beat, like the engine had clamped tight and refused to wake. I've had batteries die, alternators mess up, but this felt different. The dash went dim, and the glow on my gauge sagged almost like a breath being held. The radio tried to come alive and spat a few ranks of static. Then just as suddenly, the engine caught and the lights on the dash steadied. Whatever had had its hands on things let go enough for metal and electricity to do their parts. I didn't give it another thought other than hoping for a normal answer. I gunned the rig and pulled away out of reflex more than any plan. I didn't look back until the highway had tucked a few curves behind me, and the rear view showed only the black of the lane. When I finally turned, the station was just a dark rectangle on the shoulder. No life behind the glass. No car, no light. At the next truck stop, one with coffee that tasted like regret, and people who'd been awake long enough to be honest, I told an old driver about the note and the silhouette. He listened like most of them do. Eyes narrowed, cigarette between two fingers, the kind of look that catalogs every stray oddity and files it somewhere. "That place been shut for years," he said, tapping his mug like it had a secret he was rolling between his fingers. "Some folks say the owner went off and never came back. Others say the damn place burned and they just left the bones. Guys stop there sometimes and never make it to the next town," I had to ask. "You sure? I just drove out of there." He shrugged like the shrug covers lots of things. People tell stories to keep other people from stopping. Maybe someone else is using it for warm nights. Maybe it's kids. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe it's an old station that loves being left alone, and it don't like company. When we left, he hollered after me, "If something don't feel right, don't fight it. Keep going." I kept going. That night lodged itself under my ribs and turned with every gear shift. Every time I filled up after that, I checked the station twice, 3 times, eyes tracing the storefront to see if it had done what old places do, gone back to being ordinary. It never quite looked ordinary to me again. A few weeks later, after a run that felt like a bandage being pulled off too slow, I heard a different version of the same place from a kid named Ramon. Ramon runs regional, brand new to the long hauls, and he tells stories like he's auditioning for courage. He told me he'd stopped at a station tucked off the same strip, walked in, and found everything pristine, shelves full, candy bars lined like soldiers. He paid, went out, and someone had scrawled on his mirror with a fingernail when he got back, "Don't be late." "Could be vandals," he said when I told him my own version. "Could be kids, could be some weirdo. Or someone knew you were there," I said. "Or someone wanted you to leave." Ramon laughed then, the kind that wasn't sure what he was laughing at. "You believe in that stuff, man?" Never did before that night, still trying not to. So I left the first story there, with the gas station and the note, the silhouette and the old-timer's shrug. The thing about the road is that you learn to treat 2 kinds of certainty: the mechanical, tire pressure, oil, gears, and the human, gut fate, the hair on the back of your neck. The station gave me both a mechanical riddle and a human ripple that wouldn't smooth out. Days later, with diesel in the tanks and a sense of cautious distance, I pulled into a truck stop to rest. It was the sort of place with fluorescent lights that don't flatter anyone, and a coffee pot permanently warm and slightly bitter. Men there had faces like maps, wrinkle-lined with roots and questions. I was going in for a break I didn't know I needed, and I found the kinds of looks that let you know, without a word, that something has been said and then stopped. He asked me a question that made my skin crawl. "You alone?" It was the tone, not the question. Men ask that when they're checking inventories or wives or anything that counts cargo. The clerk behind the counter had eyes that didn't settle, like someone watching a weather pattern. The parlor area had 2 men at a back table, both sitting like they'd been there a long time and had decided the rest of the world could pass. I told him I was alone. He smiled in a way that was too practiced. "You got plans for the night?" he asked. "Just a stop to sleep," I said. He nodded and handed me a cup with a napkin. The cup felt heavier than it looked, like the coffee had secrets under its surface. The kind of place that asks questions leaves little things behind. A smell in the cab that doesn't belong to you, a shadow that doesn't belong in your mirror, the sense someone's been watching the way you move around your truck. After I'd set my head on the pillow in the sleeper, I woke later to find the door to the cab unlatched. Not open wide, but just ajar. A sliver of the outside pocked into my space. I snapped awake and checked everything. The back windows were down. The mirrors were slightly misaligned. I closed the door and slid the latch home like it was a small personal ritual. In the reflection of the glass, I thought I saw a figure sitting behind me in the bunk, a head where no head should be. It was never more than a blink. I rubbed my eyes and told myself I'd been driving too long. Maybe I'd nodded off and dreamed it. I've done long nights. I've seen the road turn folks into phantoms. When I went back to the diner portion, the two men at the back table were still there, but they weren't talking, they just watched. One of them glanced up and, without prompting, said, "We don't like folks who don't tell us where they're going." That sentence settled like ice in my gut. The menu had pancakes and eggs and a list of phone numbers on the bulletin board for local services. I called one of the numbers, an old dispatcher I know, and tried to joke it off. He didn't laugh. He told me to take a walk, to stretch, to make sure I wasn't running on fumes of sleep and imagination. I did, and the lot was as ordinary as the asphalt could manage under a sodium lamp. Still, the way the clerk had asked, "You alone?" had lodged in me. It wasn't curiosity, it was testing. I paid my tab and rolled out with my coffee gone cold. When I hit the road, my mirrors seemed to hold the same shadow for a while, always on the edge of something, like the reflexive reflection of a thing that wants to be noticed without revealing itself. A few miles up, parked on the shoulder, was an old man with a rig that looked like it had been welded together with stories. He'd seen a lot, and he gave the kind of half-smile that said he trusted his gut more than his eyes. "You sure you were alone?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. He didn't press, only said, "Watch your mirrors. Folks get the idea of you from small things. They test. It's how they know who's easy and who's not." "People like that are criminals," I said. "Or maybe drunks, or bored kids, you know." "Maybe," he said. "Maybe something else. Ain't always folk in a coat. Sometimes it feels wrong because it's wrong." I left that stop wondering about 100 things at once. The more you listen to other drivers, the more you learn that the world has layers. One layer is the advertised, the one you can point to on a map. The other layers hide in rest stops and empty gas stations, and in the way strangers ask you a question that sits wrong in your mouth afterwards. When I tell this to you now, you might say I gave the clerk too much credit, that late-night folks get weird with long faces and stranger jokes. But there's a pattern to this, small anomalies that stack until you feel like a fool for staying longer than you'd planned. The question, "You alone?" was one of those bricks. It doesn't mean anything by itself. Put 3 or 4 of them together, and they make a wall between you and a place you thought was safe. After the Parador, I tried to make light, laugh it off at the next stop, but the road has a way of collecting moments and compressing them into heat. That's what it did next. Some nights you find yourself hauling an empty trailer through hours of nothing. You'd think it's a relief, no cargo, nothing to worry over, but empty trailers have their own weight. They echo, they make sounds that full trailers won't. The third time the road turned on me, I was running empty on a stretch that felt like someone had copied desert and pasted it along the map. At first, it was little things. A bump where there shouldn't be a bump, footsteps inside the trailer when I remembered leaving it sealed, a thud that made the cab vibrate, like a distant heartbeat in metal. You get used to noises, tape, straps, the little sigh a truck makes when it settles. This wasn't that. I pulled over because the truck felt heavy. The tachometer sighed as if something inside had weight it couldn't account for. When I climbed into the trailer with a flashlight, the beam skimmed dust and polished metal, and then prints. Shoe prints, as if someone had walked a path from the front to the back and back again. Not modern athletic prints, more like work boots, heavy stitched, the kind of tread that keeps going. I followed them with the light until they led to the back door, where they stopped as if whoever wore them had walked out into the night. On one wall, someone had pressed little handprints into the dust, narrow and elongated. I touched one and felt the roughness of dried grime, but the handprints were clean within the dust, like someone had wiped them there. I didn't like the size of them. They were too small in one sense, but the fingers were long. It felt wrong to make a measurement in there, but I did, because human brains like to measure things to make sense. I closed the trailer and got in the cab. The engine protested like a dog that knows it's being woken. My phone was dead, of course, and for the first time in a long time I felt the kind of cold that wasn't air. It snagged at my fingers. I drove because you drive when your rig is your sanctuary and your sanctuary feels the least dangerous option. The radio picked up a frequency, and a gobbled voice cut through. "You need to check your load," someone said, voice thin over static. Then nothing. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe my ears were filling in words from noise. But the sound of feet, the shoe prints, the handprints in dust, those were facts. Facts and the whispering fear. I made it to a way station and pulled into a bay. The inspector was a man with a name patch and a flashlight that looked like it belonged to someone who'd seen more than dirt. He looked at my trailer like an appraiser looks at a painting. "Been in this trailer long?" he asked. "No," I said. "Fresh out." He shone his light inside and squinted. "You got something in here?" he said. "Might be old straps, might be a pallet, but it looks like someone's been living in the dirt." I couldn't explain the prints. He didn't ask what I saw. He just added another thing to the ledger of oddities and waved me on. Later that night, in the safety of a neon-lit diner, a buddy named Julian pulled his coffee close and told a story he'd heard. "They say once some people used trailers to move folks who didn't have any papers," he said. "Sometimes they never made it. Some drivers don't know. Some drivers do and they keep quiet. Sometimes trailers get stuck with that kind of weight that doesn't show up on a scale." I wanted to argue, to say I would have known, that I'd feel it. But the shoe prints had a certain path to them. They weren't footsteps of someone carried. They were of someone who had been there, walking. The rumor cast a cold shadow across the facts. You can't look at handprints and not wonder who pressed them there. You can't look at shoe prints that stop at the back of a trailer and not ask where they went. I left the trailer at first light, pulled in a different direction, and couldn't shake the feeling that something had reached out and tapped my cab. That night, the road had been thin as paper, and whatever touched it had left a mark. I was supposed to finish that run the next week, but the trailer sat on my schedule like a promise I didn't want to keep. I turned that load to someone else. Logistics don't care about feelings, only about bills and schedules. So someone else hauled it, and I kept thinking about those prints, about the hand marks in the dust. It's easy to tell yourself it's a job for someone else. Easier than admitting you don't want to know the truth. One afternoon at a truck stop, I ran into Manuel. People call him Gordo because he carries a laugh like it takes up space. Manuel's the sort who keeps old stories like photos in pockets. When I told him about the prints, he got quiet in a way that doesn't happen often with him. "They told me about a rig like that," he said. "Years back. People in the back. They left 'em. Didn't make it. We all hear things, but you don't think it's true until you see the marks." "Could be vandals," I said again. It's the default answer. It felt safer than any other. "Maybe, but think, what if it's a memory? Some places hold on. Some things get left inside metal. Sometimes you can open the door and see what used to be there, like an echo." Don't sleep too easy with that kind of story, my friend. You learn to inventory the kinds of possibilities on the road. There's the reasonable, fatigue, pranksters, vandals, the clumsy law of physics. There's the human, smugglers, thieves, people who think a rig is a room. And then there are the things that live between the lines of all those explanations. They don't have to be ghosts with a smoking vest and an agenda. They can be memories lodged in metal like a burr. I started checking trailers more often after that, not because I believed in phantoms, but because once you know the possibility of something, ignorance becomes negligence. That was the last useful thing I got from the trailer, an irritated sense of duty. Check things twice, do the little rituals that make sense. It kept my hands busy and gave my brain a job. Even with precautions, the road slipped in at night. It wasn't long after that when Manuel told me about the black dog. We were parked one evening at a roadhouse that turns out to be less roadhouse and more a collection of stories. Manuel drew his cigarette out, flicked it like an old match, and told me about a curve where trucks tended to do a specific kind of sliding. "There's a dog that sits in that hollow," he said. "Not like other dogs. It don't bark. It just stares." I didn't take it seriously at first. If there's one thing the road breeds, it's tales of omen animals, crows on a fence, a fox that crosses your path, a cat that stares like it knows the future. But Manuel had this calm in him, like a man watching weather, and the way he said it made my spine go hollow. "You see it?" I asked. "No," he said. "I saw it years ago. It sat in the road like a man waiting for the light. Its eyes are like everything in the valley caught and kept. Folks say if it shows up, either it's warning you or it's sus. You don't know till it leaves. A week later, driving a mountain pass that carves a white scar into any map, the sky bruised purple and the light slipping away, I saw a shape ahead. A black dog sat on the shoulder under a dying streetlight, impossible and very calm. It looked at me like it expected the world to stop. My brakes felt off, like there was a hesitation when I stepped on the pedal. The highway on that curve drops into a set of guardrails and then back into nothing. I tightened my grip because you've got two options in a place like that. Stop and see what's up, or keep going and pray you didn't miss the sign that told you to keep your wits. When I hit the curve, the truck shuddered, like someone had put a hand across the engine. For a long breath, I thought we were going in. Then the steering came back like it had been reattached to some god of smoothness. The rig straightened, the trailer settled, and when I looked for the dog, it had been standing in the road for a second and then vanished. There was no skid mark, no sign of an animal fleeing. It was like it folded itself into the dark. Later, at a station where the coffee tasted like metal and hope, an old-timer sat me down. His eyes had the kind of clarity that comes from paying attention to patterns. "You saw the dog?" he asked. I said I had. He nodded. "People call it protector or omen," he said, lighting a cigarette with a practiced click. "Some think it's warning, some think it's making sure the road doesn't take more than it's owed. Me? I think it's just a sign. A thing shows up where trouble likes to live." I didn't sleep much that night. Even rational men can be haunted by something as simple as a look from an animal that doesn't belong. I told myself I'd seen a feral dog, maybe someone's pet left behind, maybe a coyote with pelt thickened by months of road dust. The truck shook and my hands ached. I was awake by muscle memory, watching every reflection like a hawk. And yet, sometimes things happen that refuse clean explanation. On that long straight I mentioned earlier, the stretch of highway that makes a driver feel as if he's been spit out into the back of nothing, a strange little pattern of lights started to follow my rear view. It was late and flat as a coin. The other truck behind me kept distance, but it was there, taillights like two eyes at a measured distance. Then came the flashing. A repeated sequence, not random blinker taps, but a rhythm that felt deliberate. 3 flashes, pause, 2 flashes. I thought it was a signal, someone's way of saying, "Hey, I'm here." Drivers flash for miles of reasons, the code of the road. But this was different. The rhythm seemed like an attempt at speech. When I glanced into the bunk shortly after, I could have sworn, flatly, with the certainty a man gets from long nights, that there was someone else in the sleeper, a shape in the corner of my eye that disappeared when I looked straight at it. The mirrors showed nothing. The radio cut and put out a whisper that I couldn't parse. Then, as I swept a hand across the inside of the windshield, words trailed up like a ghost had written them on the fogged glass. "Check your load." They were smudged and imperfect, as if traced from the inside out. I thought of the trailer with the prints. It was the same cold hollow in my chest, the same list of possibilities. Prank, hallucination, a stranger with a message, or a warning from someone who had been there before me and didn't have any other way to reach out. I pulled to the side and opened the door. The cab smelled like metal and old air, my own breath and the faintest trace of something else. I checked my rig. Everything was where it should be. Chains tight, straps at their buckles, no shifting cargo. I ran my hands over the load bed like a man searching for a seam in his life. When I headed back out, the truck behind me flickered its lights once and was gone. Later, over coffee at a stop where guys swapped stories like currency, a man with tired eyes slid into my booth and said, "Check your load." He said it like it was a joke, but his voice had a memory in it. He told me about a wreck that had happened years back in that same spot, long-haul trucks stacked like cards, and a driver who died after his load shifted. "Some folks say they don't go," he said. "They keep watch." Every one of these moments is a conversation with the road, and the road is a miserly talker. It never offers more than a hint, a broken sentence. You never find out exactly whether what you saw was human recklessness, a prankster's idea of a good time, or something that lives in the folds of long nights. But you notice patterns. You pass on what you've seen, not as gospel, but as caution. I wasn't done yet. The next time something brushed the edges of what I call sense, it left me with a message that couldn't be ignored and a question I still don't have the courage to ask out loud. The sun dipped, The highway narrowed, and the lights behind me began to blink in a code that didn't fit any call I knew. My windshield fogged slightly from breath or weather or some combination of moving parts, and the words appeared. Not like someone with a pen, but like a finger on glass. The letters faint and deliberate. Check. Your load. I stood there in the cab and felt the truck around me settle like a living thing. I wanted to laugh at myself for being spooked. I wanted to roll my eyes at the idea of ghosts and omens. But a man doesn't get to 20 years without learning to be honest with his hands. I climbed out and walked the length of the trailer with a flashlight that kept failing at the wrong times, and when I opened the rear door, I found a scrap of fabric snagged on the latch that shouldn't have been there. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. I sat back in the cab, the engine idling low. Wind had started up, and somewhere down the road, a radio played a country song that didn't match my mood at all. I pulled my jacket close and tried to write the night's events down because writing things makes them smaller. But the list in my head kept growing. Signs, glances, lights, handprints. If there's a pattern here, it's that the road doesn't like to be ignored. And that's where I stopped that night. Parked on the shoulder with the long straight ahead, the sky a slab of black, and a taillight flickering in a rhythm that made my teeth ache. I drove on, because you always do, but the feeling didn't leave. It followed me like breath on the back of a neck. I ended up telling this to a handful of guys at a diner over the next few days, and each had their own tag on the story. Some said coded lights are just rigs saying hello. Others said it's a warning from drivers who know where the danger is. Ramon chalked it up to superstition. Manuel nodded and kept a silence that wasn't a refusal to believe, but a choice to keep certain things private. What I can't tell you is whether those 5 stories were the work of folks out to scare others, the aftershocks of accidents, or something else entirely. All I can tell you are the facts. The silhouette at the gas station, the question that didn't feel like curiosity at the Parador, the handprints and shoe marks in a trailer where no one should have been, a black dog that seemed to know what would happen next, and the message written on my windshield. They could be pranks, misremembered moments, tired eyes playing games with the dark. They could also be more than that. For whatever reason, shut eyes or open, the road keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets reach back. I was supposed to finish that haul without incident. I didn't. The thing that happened next started like an ordinary taillight and became something that left me checking my mirrors more than I needed to. It made me stop at places I would normally roll past and listen to the people who have been awake longer than me. When the 3rd story, about the empty trailer, was still raw in my chest, the other 2 sat heavy in my hands, and somewhere out there, the road was setting a table for something else. I pulled into a lot with a sign that didn't have a name and a faded map on the wall. The truckers around me were swapping small, useful secrets. The night was still young, in a way that felt threatening, like a fist rolled up and waiting. That's the thing about nights on the road. They always promise more. They never promise less. The long stretch ate the last of the light and flattened sound. That taillight kept its distance, like a second heartbeat behind me, patient and steady. The pattern, 3 flashes, pause, 2, kept repeating until it stopped being a curiosity and started feeling like a sentence someone was trying to spell out in a language I didn't know. I tried every reasonable thing first. I eased off the throttle to make sure it wasn't some driver signaling for me to slow. I checked my mirrors, looked for hazard lights, for a plate number, for a rig that might be trying to tell me the bridge up ahead was out or there was debris. Nothing. The cab was a cocoon of warm air and old vinyl, the only music the hum of tires on asphalt and the faint hiss of the heater. Then, in the corner of my eye, something in the sleeper moved. Small, just a suggestion of shape where there should have been only the folded blanket and the dull chrome of the vent. I told myself I was tired. That was the lazy explanation my brain reaches for when it wants to close the book on mystery. But the longer I drove, the more the signal felt less like a greeting and more like a tap on the shoulder. At a stoplight in a nowhere town, a strip of 4 buildings and a blinking pump, I pulled over, heart thudding the sort of rhythm big rigs keep when they know the road can still surprise them. I climbed out, walked back to the cab, and ran a finger across the inside of the windshield as if smudging might turn confusion into sense. There, fogged faintly by breath, was a trace traced into the haze. Check your load. The letters were messy, like someone had written with a fingertip while their hand trembled. They weren't perfectly formed, they were urgent. The message sank into me like a stone into a quiet pond. I wanted to laugh. Wanted to call it a prank from a kid at the last truck stop, but there was a pressure under my ribs I couldn't ignore. I went through the motions because the road rewards habit. Walked the length of the trailer with a flashlight, felt the chains, ran my hands over slats and straps. Nothing shifting, no seams where something might crawl. The binders were tight, the doors latched true. Yet when I stepped back into the cab, the radio, which had been playing a talk show about nothing, fell into a flat whisper. For an instant I thought I heard a breath at my ear that wasn't mine, a small exhale that belonged to the highway rather than to anybody. The taillight blinked once, like a punctuation mark, and then the truck behind me vanished into the dark. No pass, no line of taillight sliding away. It was simply gone as if someone had folded it up and put it in a pocket. I told a couple guys at the next stopover, you know the routine, swap a quick story, get a heh or a there's your answer, and move on. This time, when I told it, a man named Luis, hard face, soft laugh, he'd been hauling longer than most of us at that table, grew quiet. Quiet is a different animal on the road. It means attention, the kind that weighs the odds. You stopping at the easy spots? He asked. Pulled on the shoulder, I said. Ran the checks, nothing wrong. He leaned in like he was giving me a private map. A couple years back, there was a pileup out on that straight. One driver got smashed because his load shifted. He didn't make it. People say sometimes someone tries to warn you. Sometimes it's a guy with sleep on his face, and sometimes it's something else. Someone writing on my windshield doesn't make it a ghost story, I said. It came out sharper than I'd intended. Maybe I wanted it to end there because once you start naming the shape of things, they get weight. Maybe it's not about ghosts, Louise said. Maybe it's about guilt. Maybe it's about someone who couldn't stop themselves from trying to help. He shrugged the kind of shrug that weighs a dozen stories. The more I thought about it, the more the message felt like leverage. There are things on the highway a man can fix. A failing tire, a busted light, a burnt-out bulb. There are other things you can't do anything about. The hand that wrote on my glass, whoever had left it, had given me something simple, a command that made my hands move. A few nights later, I was parked at a place on the map everyone calls the Long Straight, where the sky opens and a driver can measure his loneliness in miles. A rig eased into the lane behind me and kept a polite space. The driver, an older fellow with a sleep-scarred face and a voice like gravel, tapped on my door. He held a coffee cup and a folded newspaper, and he looked at me like somebody looking at an old friend who hasn't been home for a while. "You checked the latch?" he asked. I did. He nodded and folded his hands over the paper. "Years ago my cousin drove that same route. His trailer shifted. He never saw the brakes. We still don't know if it was human error or something else. Sometimes, when I'm behind a rig on that stretch, I flash codes. Not to scare, just to tell you someone's watching." "Why would someone watch?" I asked. "Because you look like me," he said. "Because we owe each other that." There are 100 ways to read a man saying he flashes lights to watch you. I could have said surveillance, superstition, social wiring among drivers. But the upshot was practical. People look out for people they share a road with. That knowledge is as honest and as ghostly as anything. The thing I couldn't explain was the faceless figure I caught twice in the edges of my mirror. Not a face exactly, more a negative space where a person should be. The first time, I froze mid-shift on the highway when the radio stuttered. The second time, I woke from a nap with my hand in the air and the cold of something having brushed my arm. Each time the shape dissolved when I looked full on. Maybe it was sleep inertia, maybe it was a trick of light, maybe a truck's passing cast a shadow that did uncanny things against the bunk. Or maybe it was evidence that whatever had written on my windshield wanted closer to me than the glass would allow. A few weeks after that, I heard the rest of the story from an old driver named Hector. He'd been on the route the year of the crash Luis mentioned. He told me not to think of lights as either proof or hoax, but as signposts people used in the dark to communicate something they couldn't otherwise say. Sometimes a man doesn't know he has a warning until someone else shouts it, he said. Sometimes it's the last shout. That was the night I started doing the little rituals people laughed at. Check the straps twice, listen for extra knocks, open the back and shine the beam down as if piercing a veil. The rituals are not magical. They are practical, small things that let your hands be busy and your mind calm. They did not promise safety, they did offer the satisfaction of action. The strange things didn't stop being strange. They started becoming a pattern, an arrangement of small, unnerving events that didn't add up cleanly to a single cause. I could line them up like receipts: a closed station with a note, a clerk who asked if I was alone, shoe prints where no one should have been, a dog that watched without barking, lights that blinked a code, and words that appeared like writing on steam. Individually, any of them could be explained away. Together they were a different animal. On a raw morning with the sky tasting like iron, I sat in a donut shop and let steam fog my coffee. The room hummed with men who'd been up longer than breakfast, and the talk turned like it always does to what we had seen. Ramon, still bragging about how he never gets spooked, told a version of the gas station tale I'd first heard. Manuel, ever the generous story keeper, told the black dog story in a voice that made you feel the curve in your hands. "The thing you gotta watch," Manuel said, tapping the saucer like it held the shape of the conversation, "is how little the road gives you. It'll hand you a look, a noise, a mark. It won't tell you what it wants. That's on you." "Maybe it's all criminals and shams and tired eyes," Ramon chimed in, folding a napkin. "Maybe it ain't. Don't mean you got to believe, just means don't be stupid." That kind of middle ground is where I sit now. I don't have a definitive answer. I have evidence that curiosity on the road can be dangerous and helpful. I've learned to listen when someone else, stranger or neighbor, carries a story with the edges smoothed by repetition. It's not that I fully trust legends. It's that I respect the catalog of near misses. People talk because they've seen patterns that could save a life, or because talking is the only way to exhale after a strange night. Some months passed. I did more runs. I did them with a ginger hand on the lock and a thorough walk around my trailer before I buckled everything down. The prints in the empty trailer haunted me in ways that made me do the checks I should have been doing anyway. The silhouette at the station made me leave quicker from places that felt wrong. The question, "You alone?" lodged like a splinter. The black dog's stare is now a picture I carry when I approach dangerous curves. The coded light and the words on my windshield changed a habit. Now I write down what I see. If nothing else, it feels good to pin a day to a thing. The best I can do is tell you the facts I carried and leave the interpretations where they belong, on your counter. You can put a label on them: prank, coincidence, tired eyesight, vigil, omen, ghost. I have friends who will accept one label and scoff at the other. I have friends who keep quiet because for them, it's not worth the risk of looking foolish for admitting they once stepped back from a place that gave off a bad feeling. The last of the 5 stories folded into my life slowly. A week after the lights spelled out their warning, I was negotiating a blind corner when a truck 2 lanes over dipped its beam at me in a slow, deliberate sweep. The driver had a look on his face like he'd been in a war and come back with an answer that didn't make sense. He nodded at me like a man who had seen something similar and decided to give me the benefit of whatever belief that required. "Keep your nose clean," he mouthed. His gesture wasn't supernatural, it was community. It was a fellow driver telling me in a language we use, the smallest language of nods and flashes, that someone had my back. That is perhaps the most compelling explanation for half of these things. Human networks, a kind of informal watch system born of long hours and shared risk. Men who have to rely on other drivers learn to read codes into light and shadow. They learn to leave gestures in places where no one will admit to being guardian. But that doesn't account for everything. The handprints, the vanished dog, the silhouette that never took a step. Those are the details that keep me sitting up at night, not because I fear them in a literal sense, but because they resist fitting into tidy explanations. I still get the laughs when I tell these tales. People enjoy a good spooky story because it lets them feel the goosebumps without the danger. I expect that. I also expect some of you will tell me I've spun a better tale than the truth deserves. That's fair. But for every guy who laughs at the table, there are 3 who sit silent and stare into their coffee like they're measuring tomorrow's route. Those are the ones whose silence I trust. If you drive at night, maybe you already know these things. Maybe this is all familiar, the small, quiet alarms that the road gives you. If you don't drive, maybe these stories sound like campfire talk. Either way, the point isn't whether I can prove any of them. The point is that the road is a different map at night. It keeps secrets. It hands out warnings in strange parcels. It rewards habits that are small and stupidly sensible, checks, walks, second looks, and punishes the complacent. So which of these do I believe? Which do I think are real? If pressed, I'd say this. All of them are real, in the way that things that change how you move through the world are real. Whether that change comes from an actual presence or from human hands, or from the nether something in between, it doesn't matter so much as the fact that the change happened. The road taught me to listen, to heed, to leave sometimes when a place asked me to. Before I wrap this up, before you go arguing with me in the comments, tell me this. Which of these 5 do you think actually happened? Which one do you chalk up to prank or to tired eyes? Drop your vote and your own stories in the comments. If you've got a mile of your own to add to this, tell it. We learn from the ledger of experience more than from any single certainty. And one last thing. If you're out there on a lonely stretch and something feels wrong, remember what an old driver once told me. If the road speaks, listen. If it hollers, move. It isn't advice dressed up as prophecy. It's a gut-level survival tip polished by time. I don't have ghosts in my cab. At least not the kind you can point to and say, see? What I do have are nights that rearranged my habits and a list of moments that don't sit comfortable in my mind. Maybe they're nothing, maybe they're everything. Either way, they are mine to carry. Which one made you sleep with the light on? Which one would you laugh off? Tell me below. Share this with someone who drives after dark. Let them decide for themselves. And if you ever find yourself alone on a long road, keep your hands on the wheel, check your mirrors, and don't hesitate to keep rolling when a place feels wrong. The highway keeps its own counsel, and sometimes, whether out of kindness or spite, it chooses to tell you a secret.